My name is James Lynsday, and welcome to this online presentation. Because I don't have an audience, I'm relying on an image from a gatefold sleeve of the Rocky Horror Show audience. I hope you're dressed for the occasion. I know I am. Today I'm going to be talking about managing exploratory testing. Now, I'm a test strategist, so I get to help people with what they're going to plan and how they're going to plan when it comes to software testing. And for me, one of the key problems of exploratory testing is that it is a beggar to manage. Or rather, it's not that it's difficult, it's that it confounds some of the things that we would normally want and try to manage. And that's because it is, in systems thinking terms, it's a wicked problem. Now, systems thinkers characterize wicked problems as problems whose solution is not clear until they're found. This distinguishes wicked problems from tame problems, problems like you might have had in maths classes, where you're given an equation to solve and it solves. Of course, most equations don't have a solution. Many problems are wicked problems. And I think that as testers we need to acknowledge that when we step out and we look for surprises, we have no idea whether we've found all the surprises until we've found them. So with that in mind then, how have I seen exploratory testing being managed? Let me try and characterize it with a few stories. Way back in the early 90s, I worked in a team which was testing stuff, and every test had to have a script that went with it, and every script had to have a screenshot for every step. This was, as you would imagine, an onerous requirement for those of us who were trying to test. And so we dealt with that by doing what we were asked to do. But we also went further. We hid two guys in the corner and we worked so that all our rotten scripts with all their screen prints were up to date and done, but our two guys in the corner found all the bugs. Now, from time to time, we would need to reverse engineer a script that would find the bugs that they found, so that we had a script to go with it for auditing purposes. We were praised for how good our scripts were, how clever we were as test designers to write scripts that found such excellent bugs. But the fact remained, nobody was going to pay us to find bugs. And yet, in order for us to feel human, but also in order for us to do our jobs as testers, we had to find problems. And I believe that this was tacitly acknowledged as we went up through the organisation. This is a relatively common pattern, and although I wouldn't stand for it now, it happened in the early 90s, it still does happen, and I still go to organisations which have a group of heroic testers that switch in and out of bug finding stealth mode. And they go and they find bugs, and they feel slightly subversive. They have a lot of fun. It's kind of heroic. They don't necessarily let on about what they're doing. They often don't share what they're doing. And they find loads of really important problems that then feed back into the more positive side of showing that stuff works. So that's one way of managing it. That's one way that I've seen, to take the exploratory testers and shove them in a corner because you don't have budget, you don't have authority, you don't have justification for doing this work, but perhaps you would find not doing the work outrageous. That leads me to a second pattern, perhaps an anti-pattern. An anti-pattern in that it is characteristic of something not so good happening. Sometimes I go to organisations that genuinely don't want to find problems. They want to manage exploratory testing, such as it is, by, maybe not obstructing, but perhaps asking for many things that are quite difficult for an exploratory tester to provide, like scripts that find the bugs they find, like absolutely cast iron reproducible problems, like problems that can be linked directly to the specification. Now, they don't want to find problems because sometimes finding problems is a liability, by which I mean a legal liability. Be aware of that anti-pattern if you find yourself in the pattern of stealth bug finding. Perhaps you're not being asked to find problems because problems are not wanted nor needed in the organisation that you're working with, and in that case you'll have to work with your conscience to find out which direction you go. So that's one pattern in which I've seen exploratory testing managed. Let's have a look at a second pattern. This second pattern typically gets called the bug bash. In a bug bash, well, somebody books the canteen out for maybe 2 hours between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, and amidst the clatter of the kitchen staff sorting out the upcoming lunch, there are a group of people from the test team, from the coding team, from the design team, from the users and beyond, and they are given something to test. The bug bash lasts for a couple of hours, maybe a bit less. There tends to be a lot of laughter and hooting and whooping as people find bugs, and many bugs are found. Sometimes bug bashes have a bit of a problem. They're very equipment heavy, but of course the equipment is only needed for the duration of the bug bash. If you have a bug bash once a month, but everybody in that bug bash needs to bring their own kit and have their own deployed software, then you've got a lot of work to do. The second thing is everybody tends to be on identical software in an identical environment, or perhaps an identical system in an identical environment, so you find a lot of problems to do with the test environment and perhaps not so many to do with the thing itself, the thing you're trying to test. You'll turn up a lot of similar problems because everybody in the room, although they may be coming to this product with their own needs, everybody in the room comes to it perhaps as a novice, or perhaps comes to it from the same position of working in the same organisation. This is one of the problems with dog fooding. So a bug bash lasts for a couple of hours. It's relatively expensive actually in terms of man hours, but it's relatively cheap in terms of elapsed time. It's expensive in terms of equipment should you need lots of kit that isn't used for the rest of it, but it's cheap in that you can just grab hold of people and off they go testing. My problem with it is, and I do have a problem with it, as you'll know if you've read my blog, my problem with it is that I don't think it finds very good bugs. And one of the main reasons for that is that people aren't learning from each other. They might be testing with each other and they might learn to the extent that you can and do learn for over a couple of hours. But I think that there is a big problem. And the big problem is that it's only over that couple of hours. There isn't an ongoing learning. There isn't a growth in knowledge about the product. There's a splurge, a fire hose of information, much of it very similar, not much of it learnt from. Bug bashes produce a lot of bugs. An anti-pattern for a bug bash would be the kind of work that occasionally, if you're known as an exploratory tester, you tend to get asked to do. And that kind of work is where you're trying to break something on behalf of one party. So let me give you a couple of examples. If I'm brought in by an organisation to find as many problems as we can so that we can send a particular release of software back to a supplier, now that'll cause perhaps contractual problems. The number of bugs that have been found is sometimes in a contract, and sometimes there's a fix problem there. You find 100 bugs, you may well overwhelm the fixing group, you might cause a change to the contract, or at least a change to the acceptability of various clauses in the contract. Finding bugs can be an offensive move, and there is no more offensive position to be in finding bugs than to be working in an agile team, perhaps again dropped in as representing a customer, and to sit there and find so many bugs that you entirely stuff the workflow of the agile team. This is also an anti-pattern. This is something to look out for as, let's just say not terribly effective. So, two approaches that we see from time to time. Stealthiness, where you hide your testing away, and the bug bash, where you bring it all out in the open and find just as many problems as you can all at once in one lump. I can't say that I'm terribly impressed with either of those two choices from a management point of view. Generally, if I'm trying to manage something, I'm trying to perhaps introduce some degree of shared direction. I'm trying to get people to work together rather than individually. I'm trying to maybe have some degree of monitoring, or in a better word, understanding what is going on in the group, so that I can help that group set their direction to something that they are pleased with overall. So I'm not sure that if I've got a stealthy group finding problems, but I'm denying how they're finding those problems, I'm not sure that I'm managing that terribly well. Equally, I'm not sure that I'm helping people work together if all I do is bring them together for a couple of hours at a time for a bug bash. But there are other approaches. It is perhaps irrational to say, if you're setting out to look for surprises, how long is it going to take me? Instead, perhaps we should ask, how much time am I going to give myself to look? It's a gamble. Your budget isn't necessarily set to somehow match the value of things you're going to find, but maybe rather more influenced by what you have available to allow you to look. If you're comfortable with a gamble, you may be comfortable with managing ET by lobbying for a budget from the project and working to find a good way of spending that budget for the project. Let me try out a couple of examples. If I say I want to spend 40 hours in the first week after delivery looking for trouble, that's a gamble. If I say I'll need somebody for 3 days to prepare the exploratory environments, data, tools and various ideas, that's an investment with a deliverable at the end of it that I can be fairly sure of getting to. Now, these aren't opposites, they support each other. You'll have goals for both, and you can schedule both. And you can take a gamble to your project manager. Your project manager, you may well find, is not actually uncomfortable with the gamble. Now, he or she may recognise testing as a wicked problem. No one thanks you for dropping a wicked problem into their lap. However, some of the project managers, many of the project managers that I've met, are rather good gamblers, instinctively and analytically weighing up risk and return. Their talents as managers extend well beyond simply juggling durations and dependencies. If you're comfortable with the gamble yourself, and candid about the realities of exploratory testing and convincing about your skills, the project manager's eyes may just light up and the game is on. You'll likely get some proportion of what you're looking for, and you'll go looking for problems. Of course, managing exploratory testing doesn't end here, but this is where it can start. So what happens next? Generally, a monstrous growth in ideas. Testers can come up with huge quantities of really rather good ideas about what to test next. The question is not necessarily coming up with those ideas, it is how to handle so many. It's how to marshal them, how to prioritise them, how to combine them and allocate them. That's the key problem for managing exploratory testing. Your set of ideas will grow monstrously until it reaches some kind of limit. Now, you may be limited by the attention span of your testers, by the patience of those who are sponsoring them, by the wall space that they're sticking the ideas onto. Now, assuming that you see these limits as reasonably irrational, you're going to want your testers to develop skills not just in generating ideas, but in filtering those ideas, throwing them away. Your testers are going to have to learn to live with some degree of endowment bias. The endowment bias is where you don't like throwing away things you already have, particularly not if you've worked hard for them. Test ideas that have arrived in the middle of the night, that you've woken up and scribbled down on a bit of paper, may be hard to leave behind. But they will have to be, as better and stronger ideas turn up. If, all things being equal, I'm asked to have a look over a selection of testing ideas that should power an exploratory process, I want to see diversity rather than quantity. How to manage that monstrous growth? Well, there are lots of ways. I'll deal with two. One way of making the ideas and the gamble visible is to take your various testing ideas, allocate an amount of time that you might gamble on it, and stick it on the wall. And as you stick it on the wall, if you've made sure that the things you're sticking in some way represent the amount of time you're giving them, then you can easily see whether you're getting close to the limits of your overall gamble or not. That helps you take stuff off the wall when you're getting towards the edges of that gamble. Be careful that it doesn't stop you putting new things on. As you continue to test, you'll be moving those sticky notes about Kanban style. You may well find that some of your tests take longer than others, or that some of your tests take longer than you expected them to do. As you migrate the time that you've decided to gamble into time that has been spent, you're easily able to visualize how much time you've taken and potentially then prioritize the new ideas that are coming in against those old ideas you've not done yet. It's a good way to concentrate hard on the resources that you've got in terms of time. Other people work in different ways. Steve Green's consultancy, Test Partners, will take on a piece of your exploratory testing work. Steve was at the London Tester Gathering the other night showing off a spreadsheet that he uses. Every new idea goes onto a spreadsheet which is pre-populated with some excellent test ideas depending on what kind of technology he's testing for you. That approach might well lend itself to an ever-expanding, ever-increasing amount, but as with spreadsheets, Steve's spreadsheet keeps track of the work that's been done, and you can easily move to a more visual representation of how that's working for you. These kind of tools are useful to help you manage your testing effort. But there's more to management than simply schedules and budgets and gambles. Perhaps as a test manager you've decided to use exploratory testing because of the very swift feedback it gives you between the point when an artifact arrives in your team and the point when you can start to give useful information back to the makers of that artifact. Agile teams tend to be very familiar with fast feedback between test execution and the result going back into the group that made it, and they're happy with that, but that tends to be much more confirmatory than perhaps will be coming out of your exploratory test team. Your exploratory test team is giving fast feedback not simply between test execution and test result, but between test design and test result, and that fast feedback allows them to chase after risks and problems and bugs. Feeding that information back into your designers and coders is potentially pretty useful, but can also be unwelcome. As a coder, I find it quite discombobulating sometimes to be given information about how badly things are working when I'm trying my damnedest to make them work at all. But perhaps the most frustrating thing for me as a test manager is if an exploratory testing team has developed a culture of triumphalism about finding bugs. To go to a coding team with a smirk and a bug and an insult does nobody any favours, particularly not the organisation you're working for and its customers. Be aware of the power that exploratory testing can give you and try hard not to do anything too nauseating. Feedback on novel modes of behaviour and unanticipated failures can deeply challenge a team who thought their design was watertight. I've been told that bugs aren't bugs unless they're found by a customer, and that any bug without an immediately obvious fix is a feature. I see both these reactions as denial, and an indication that I should have prepared the ground better for the kind of feedback I can offer from exploring the product. The situation is made much easier if you're working with a real customer or a user rather than acting as some kind of proxy. But be aware that the cry of pain you hear might also indicate that your testing priorities don't match the priorities of the people constructing the system. It's your call whether you should realign or whether you should embrace that difference. Exploratory testing empowers testers. It has to. If you give a tester the responsibility of designing their tests, of prioritizing those tests, of deciding what a test looks like and what a result looks like, what a bug looks like, then you have empowered them. But empowered testers may lead to insecure management. As a test manager, if you've chosen to use exploratory testing, maybe you're okay with this. Maybe your management, however, is not. I would suggest that you voluntarily offer to make your sponsor feel secure. I find that it helps to make a clear agreement about responsibilities and also about material deliverables. Try saying something along the lines of, we'll keep a steady pace of exploration with a public counter of time spent. We'll make a visual distinction of those ideas we've used with those ideas we won't use during this cycle. You'll make sure you can see the time that's been spent, and we can drill down from that time into the bugs that have been found, and from the bugs that have been found into the reports of what testing was going on. We'll come to you at the start, the end, regular intervals throughout testing to keep you up to date. We'll come to you for help with obstacles we can't overcome ourselves and with decisions about change to budget and staff. But we won't come to you with decisions about test direction and test prioritization. Or, of course, you can go back to hiding a couple of testers in the corner again. Once exploratory testing is chugging along, you hope to reach a point where not only are you finding plenty of bugs, but perhaps fewer bugs are being made. And as a consequence of that, I have had complaints from metrics people that fewer bugs are being found. I think this is a neat demonstration of failure demand. I find it easier to set it as a desired goal at the outset, rather than to have to explain it as a side effect. Sometimes I'll put this in terms of, we will not necessarily find more problems, but we will find more useful problems, and we hope to find them faster. Although I do agree that this is trying to wrap a wicked problem in a simple solution. Similarly, I find that some metrics problems will count a day where the test team find loads of problems as a bad day. I find that it's easy to help them deal with that pain if I've already had a conversation with them about how much worse it would be if all that trouble was revealed on a later day. Talking about metrics, plenty of teams seem scared of putting exploratory testing in front of auditors. I'm not entirely sure why. The auditors and assurance people I've met seem to do a lot of exploration in their work, and I've always found it helpful to ask the appropriate auditors about what they might expect to see from exploratory testing before we start exploring. If there is, for instance, an unadjustable regulation that stipulates all tests must be planned, the auditors are not only most likely to know about it, but most likely to be able to give you an indication about what they might accept. Where planned means recorded in a plan, then a plan is a historical document, not a future document. And that small change in perspective can let you come to a mutual agreement that tests should be recorded in the plan after they have been complete as a record of what was done, not necessarily as a prediction of what will be done. If auditors have a place in your organisation, then it's better to expect them than to hide. Talk to them and negotiate what they need for assurance. Along with your list of tests, you'll develop a library of tools. Now, I don't mean a downloadable executable, but something that arises from the combination of mindless machinery, data configuration, and conscious application from the minds of the team. Some tools arise as testers automate their manual brain-engaged testing, and as the automation takes over, the tool will change the way a tester triggers problems and their ability to observe surprises. Other tools arise because they enable a whole new class of tests, and using the tool even briefly exposes a new perspective with its own easily accessible bugs. A tool armory is one of the core assets of an exploratory testing team and should be encouraged by the management. Exploratory testing without tools is weak and slow. As with any library, it needs to be organised to be useful. If I can, I try to keep a public list of tools, techniques, tricks and test data, perhaps tagged with general useful areas and knowledgeable users. I encourage people to name and share their approaches and try to get individuals to pair on tool use or to hold Swift training workshops. Exploratory testing is a gamble, and once you set aside time to employ in that gamble, you stand to get a great deal back. One of the best known ways to manage exploratory testing is session-based test management. This approach, developed, named and promoted by James and John Bach, is the most familiar and one of the most effective ways of managing exploratory testing. In session-based testing, the testers come up with charters. Each charter is done in a session that takes maybe 30 minutes or maybe 3 hours. Session reports are fairly comprehensive. They're collected. Individual testers will talk to each other about what they've done in a session, and this for me is one of the key parts of session-based testing as a management technique. In session-based testing, we keep good notes. At the end of each session, we debrief those notes. The information from that session, what we found, what we tried, what we didn't try, is shared within the team. And if exploratory testing is, to take Bach's popular definition, simultaneous learning, test design and test execution, then that feedback helps us learn. And without learning, I would put forward that there's really very little exploration. There's just wandering about. Any effective approach to exploration has to involve learning, has to involve the development of models and understanding and a way of capturing the information that exploration gives you. Exploratory testing is no different, and session-based testing has feedback in spades. One of the difficulties that people have in session-based testing is the time it takes for people within the team to feed back to their manager. So, for instance, if you've got 5 people in your team, each is exploring for, let's say, 4 hours a day, and they take perhaps 5% of their session time in feeding back, then that is, let me think, 10% of 20 hours, which is 2 hours. It's quite a lot. Most managers resent spending that time with their testers, which I think is curious, but I do understand where they're coming from. They, of course, have meetings to go to. So, how to get around that? Well, firstly, I found it very useful to encourage teams to feedback within the team. Peer feedback is, I think, very strong. The second thing is that as a hands-on test manager, you definitely want to be involved in these bits of feedback. Perhaps other things are actually less important. On the other hand, you may not be a hands-on test manager. You may need to let your team get on with it. I would have a look at how happy you are empowering your team to work in a session-based way. And if you're not happy with empowering them, I wonder why you've chosen it in the first place. When I sit with excellent exploratory testing teams, they don't all use session-based testing. They certainly don't all use bug bashes. When they come to gamble time, it's almost unacknowledged. Now, of course, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, so I might be able to say that these people manage their exploratory testing by magic. I think that would probably be wrong. Any sufficiently advanced magic is, of course, indistinguishable from technology. I suspect that what's going on when I and others sit down and put our hands on a keyboard and bugs are revealed is actually something more complex. I think that there is an understanding of pathologies. I think there's an understanding of technology. I think there's an understanding of the way the system fits together, and people build models as they go. This is a learnt skill. It's not a swiftly learnt skill. And I think the management of time at an individual level certainly goes with the management of exploration. Whether that can scale to many people on a team, or whether that magic can scale to people who haven't done exploratory testing before, I'm not sure. I've seen some very, very excellent exploratory testers who've done hardly any exploratory testing before, but then they were all phenomenally bright and phenomenally competitive because they were the Oxford First Aid boat. So let's speculate about where exploratory testing may go after this. Well, I think that it will be a good idea for all exploratory testers to have a look at what's going on in machine learning. Machines are thoroughly capable of scooting around a network of connections, and I imagine that actually quite a lot of our software could be covered by some of their mapping. They're also good at spotting things that are unusual once they're helped to understand what unusual might look like, and they're good at taking things that they find that they recognize and working out whether they cluster, and if they do cluster, what kind of clusters they're in. I expect that we'll see tools that support exploratory testing coming out of the machine learning industry, and I hope to be using those tools soon. If anybody is working on any of those tools, would they just get in touch with me? I'd love to find out what you're doing, and honestly, I'd love to help. If you want to play with some of these things, well, can I suggest you grab hold of a web spidering tool and then Gephi, G-E-P-H-I. Put that into Gephi and explore your networks in that way. You may well see paths and clusters that otherwise you might not. Other industries explore as well. We see exploration in the oil industry, we see exploration in the car industry, we see exploration in academia. How do they manage exploration? They reduce the costs, they look for more opportunities. Specifically though, they acknowledge what they're doing. They develop individual teams that go off in order to explore, that have a budget that is a gamble. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'd encourage you to read the work of Sylvain Lonflet from the Management Research Centre in Paris. You can find him, I'm sure, on the internet. In conclusion then, exploratory testing is difficult to manage. It's difficult to manage because it's a wicked problem. Its solution is not clear until that solution is found. Key problems within exploratory testing include not simply coming up with the ideas, but handling that collection, working with the fast feedback and the novel information that gives you on a project. If you're the kind of manager who likes to monitor and control the people who work with you, you may find that some of the greatest difficulties lie around the empowerment that exploratory testing needs you to give your testers. But that's one of the reasons why exploratory testing makes testers so enthusiastic and so engaged with their jobs. And if, as a manager, you haven't yet understood that enthusiastic and engaged employees do better work, then perhaps you need to think again. My name's James Lynsday. I'm a test strategist. Thank you very much for listening to this. I believe I will now be online for questions and answers. If you've got anything you'd like to say to me, please follow the appropriate procedure. Thank you.